Back in episode 46, I talked about early versus late banding of buck kids. We went through the full debate, the urinary calculi argument, the research, all of it, and I reported on a small test group we'd banded at birth. I said I'd follow up when we did it at scale. We've now done it at scale, and this is that follow-up. Let's get to it. Hey there, welcome to GoatWise. I'm Millie Bradshaw, animal scientist and rancher. Here we talk meat goats, feeding strategies, goat fencing, and livestock management that holds up in real life. If you care about raising goats well and building systems that actually work, you're in the right place. Let's talk livestock. If this podcast has been helpful, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Scroll down to ratings and reviews, tap the stars, and leave a few sentences. It helps more serious livestock producers find the show, and I read every one of them. Then go grab the free kidding due date chart at goatwise.com/kidding-chart. That also gets you on the insider email list. The link is in the show notes. Here's what's happening on the ranch. Kidding is nearly done, just one doe left. I got a good look at her yesterday and she's bagging up, so she is going to kid. Once she kids and I get all the data pulled together, I'll put out the full annual kidding report. This has been an exceptional year. Really what we've been working toward for 8 years. We're not going to wait for that last doe before we start with the no-fence collars. The collars are charging now, and once they're ready, we'll get started with collaring and the training process. If that last doe doesn't get a move on, she might just become the first doe to kid with a collar on, which would actually be useful data for us going into next year. There are over 150 kids running around out here right now, and they're a lot of fun to watch. But they're turning into hooligans, so it's about time they head to pasture and burn off some of that energy somewhere productive. Darcy's bottle feeding is very manageable now with the bottle rack Stacy built her, and she's doing great. She's also getting a couple of goats ready to be in the local 4th of July parade this week, so that's happening. All right, episode 46 was the setup. This is the follow-up I promised. If you haven't heard episode 46 and you want the full early versus late banding debate, the urinary calculi argument, what the research says, all of that, go back and listen to that one first. I'm not going to cover that again in this episode, and it's important background information. What I want to do today is tell you what I've observed since then, what convinced me, and what happened when I tried to solve a different problem the conventional way. Twice. Last year was the first time I really saw the difference side by side in a meaningful way. At buck selection in September, we banded everything that didn't make the cut as a replacement buck. So I had a group of late banded kids and a group of kids that had been banded at birth, all in the same pasture, raised under the same conditions, and when we got to weaning, those late banded kids just could not compare to the ones that had been banded at birth. The difference was astounding. Coat condition, overall appearance, growth, the early banded wethers were exceptional. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of difference that makes you stop and go back and rethink your whole approach. I do have some weights from that fall, and I want to mention them briefly, but I want to be really careful about how I present them because they're not clean data. At buck selection on September 20th, the early banded wether kids averaged 35.8 pounds. The intact buck kids averaged 34.5 pounds. And I know what you might be thinking. Shouldn't the intact bucks be heavier? Here's the thing. Those intact bucks were the ones we had kept specifically because they were the best. There is real selection bias there. We were already choosing for the best looking, best growing animals to stay intact. So the fact that they averaged 34.5 pounds compared to 35.8 pounds for the early wethers is interesting, but it is not proof of anything. By the time of sale in March 2026, they were essentially equal, 67.9 versus 67.2 pounds. What that suggests to me is that the late-banded kids did catch up over winter, but they needed a whole winter to do it. And the number I don't have, and I wish I did, is a weaning weight or a weight about a month after late banding, because that's where the real economic impact would show up for most producers who are selling kids in the fall. I watched those late banded kids fall apart in October and spend November through March catching back up. I just can't prove it with the data I have. It's worth keeping in mind if you're selling into the fall market, which we will be doing this fall. This year, we went ahead and banded almost everything at birth. One intact buck kid. He came out of a set of quadruplets, exceptional dam, 6 years of proven production behind her, and everything else got banded. And I'll tell you, it's so much easier on the kids when you band them as newborns. Very few of them even acted like it bothered them. They had just been born, which is the hardest thing they've done in their entire lives up to that point. A band just wasn't that big a deal in comparison. Contrast that with banding at 8 weeks or at buck selection. Those kids feel it. It sets them back. You can see it. Early banding is genuinely kinder, in my opinion. But here's the part I think is actually the bigger argument for early banding, and it's something I learned the hard way. More than once. In the fall of 2023, we had intact buck kids in with the does longer than we should have, and goats mature faster than you think. Some of them are actively breeding by 8 to 10 weeks old. Those does that got bred by the intact buck kids in the fall of 2023 kidded in March of 2024. Every single one was a single. Wrong breeding time of year for high fertility, limited feed, wrong buck, wrong everything. That was our wake-up call. So in fall of 2024, we moved our buck selection date up earlier. Thought we had it handled. We didn't. Still ended up with early breeding and had to lutalize the entire doe herd to reset their cycles and prevent another round of March kids. In fall of 2025, we moved weaning up again. Still not early enough. Lutalized again. 3 years of unintended breeding, 2 times solving the problem after the fact instead of before it. And here's the thing about lutalize. It works, it does what it's supposed to do, but it disrupts the natural cycle. We're used to seeing a very clear kidding peak at 7 to 10 days. When you lutalize, that peak changes. It's not a big deal, but you do have to manage that lutalized dosing in a very labor-intensive way so that you don't have every doe come into heat at once, which would overwhelm the buck and he'd have a hard time covering all the does. Basically, you end up managing a consequence instead of preventing the problem. It's not a solution, it's a reset. Now, the obvious question, why not just wean earlier? That sounds like the best plan, but it's not practical in real life in our size herd. Here's why. Let's say you have a tight kidding season that finished up in 4 weeks. If you set your weaning date at 8 weeks from your first kid born to prevent any chance of early breeding, your latest kids are only 4 weeks old, and 4 weeks is too young to wean. If you set your weaning date at 8 weeks from your last kid, your earliest ones are already 12 weeks old, and many will be fully capable of breeding. There is no clean date in a herd even if you have a tight kidding window. The math just doesn't work. And if you don't have a tight kidding window, it's even worse. So even if I could find the right date, fall is the worst possible time to carve out a whole crew day on a ranch that also runs a fencing business. We are at full throttle from September 1st. This year, it's starting even earlier. It's not that I don't want to wean on the right day. It's that I genuinely cannot always make that happen. And I don't think I'm alone in that. Fence jobs don't move because the goats are ready to be weaned. Life happens in the fall as we race to finish projects before winter sets in. Early banding eliminates the date problem entirely. There's no window to miss, no crew to coordinate in the middle of fence season, no lutealizing the whole herd after the fact, no wondering who sired what because things ran longer than planned. That last piece matters more than it might sound. When you have unintended early breeding, you lose sire records. Unless you're DNA testing, you don't know who bred who. And for us, running breeding stock, building a herd we're actively selecting, trying to keep accurate production data, that matters a lot. We need to know who the sires are. Unintended breeding is a data problem as much as a management problem. I realize that this is not an issue for every operation. If your system is set up differently, if you have a small enough group to manage the timing easily, if early kids don't cause problems for your operation, then this may not be a problem you need to solve. But if it is, now you know what it looked like in our operation over 3 years of trying to solve it a different way and why we landed where we landed. For anyone running a ranch operation in a busy season, which is all of us really, and if you're trying to maintain accurate data and raise quality breeding stock, early banding is managing the problem before it starts. And sometimes that is the best management you can do. The only thing I have to keep track of this year is getting that one intact buck kid weaned by 8 weeks from his birth date. That's it. Everything else is already handled. And honestly, that's a pretty good place to be. If you have any questions, send me an email, millie@drycreekpastures.com. See you next week. Hey there, thanks for listening today. If this episode was helpful, share it with another producer who's raising goats. And if you haven't already, leave a quick review on Apple Podcasts. It helps more serious livestock owners find the show. As always, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not a substitute for veterinary advice. I'll see you next week here on GoatWise.